What if Harry Potter was in love with Bellatrix Lestrange? This is perhaps one of the most controversial and darkest alternate timelines we could explore in the wizarding world. It challenges everything we know about Harry's character, his moral compass, and the very nature of good versus evil in the Harry Potter universe. Today, we're diving deep into this twisted scenario to see how it could possibly unfold and what devastating consequences it would bring to the wizarding world as we know it. Before we begin, let's establish who Bellatrix Lestrange truly is. She's not just another Death Eater. She's Voldemort's most loyal, most fanatical, and most dangerous follower. She's a sadist who takes pleasure in torture. She personally tortured Frank and Alice Longbottom into insanity, leaving Neville an orphan in every way that matters. She killed Sirius Black, Harry's godfather and last connection to his parents, laughing as she did it. She's everything Harry should despise, everything he fights against. So how could these two polar opposites possibly come together? To make this scenario even remotely plausible, we need to find a divergence point in the timeline, where their paths could cross differently. In canon, Harry first encounters Bellatrix at the Department of Mysteries when she's already a fully committed Death Eater, already responsible for destroying Neville's parents, already deep in Voldemort's service. Their relationship is defined by hatred from that very first moment. But what if things were different? What if their first meeting happened under completely altered circumstances? Let's imagine a scenario where Harry encounters Bellatrix before her complete descent into darkness. We know from the books that Bellatrix was sorted into Slytherin and came from the noble Black family. She was beautiful, charismatic, and powerful. But what turned her into the monster we know? What if Harry somehow traveled back in time, perhaps through a magical accident more severe than what happened in Prisoner of Azkaban, and met Bellatrix Black before she became Bellatrix Lestrange? Before she took the dark mark, before Voldemort twisted her mind completely? Picture this. Harry, through some catastrophic time-turner accident or perhaps a mysterious ancient magical artifact, finds himself thrown back to the early 1970s. He's still himself, still has his memories, but he's now physically present in an era where his parents are just students, where Voldemort is still known as Tom Riddle to some, and where Bellatrix Black is a seventh-year student. Brilliant and dangerous, but not yet the cackling murderer she'll become. Harry, desperate to find a way back to his own time, has to navigate this dangerous period while keeping his true identity secret. In this timeline, Harry might encounter Bellatrix in the library, researching dark magic even as a student. She'd be intrigued by this mysterious new student who seems to know advanced magic, who has a darkness in his eyes that speaks of terrible experiences. Harry, for his part, would be disturbed to meet the woman who will one day kill his godfather, but she's not that person yet. She's younger, not yet marked by Azkaban's cruelty, not yet completely consumed by her devotion to Voldemort. There's still something human in her eyes, still a witch who could have chosen differently. Their first conversations would be tense, electric. Bellatrix would be drawn to Harry's power, his knowledge of magic that shouldn't exist yet, his obvious trauma that mirrors something in her own damaged soul. Harry would be horrified by his own fascination, by the way he can't help but notice her intelligence, her raw magical ability, her dark charisma. He knows what she'll become, but here, now, she's not that person yet. It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion, knowing the disaster that's coming but being unable to look away. As weeks pass and Harry remains trapped in the past, unable to find a way home, he and Bellatrix would develop a strange, twisted relationship. She'd see him as a kindred spirit, someone else who understands the allure of powerful magic, who doesn't shy away from darkness. Harry would find himself in an impossible position. Should he try to change her fate, to prevent her from becoming a Death Eater? Would that even be possible, or is her darkness too fundamental to who she is? And more disturbingly, why does part of him not want to change her at all? The attraction would grow despite Harry's better judgment. Bellatrix would be unlike anyone he's ever known, not gentle like Ginny, not bookish like Hermione, but fierce, passionate, unafraid of her own power. She'd challenge him in ways no one else could, push him to explore magic he'd never dare touch, make him question everything he thought he knew about himself. And Harry, traumatized by years of fighting Voldemort, carrying the weight of so many deaths, might find a twisted comfort in someone who doesn't expect him to be the hero, who accepts and even admires his darkness. Their relationship would be intense, destructive, built on a foundation of secrets and lies. Harry couldn't tell her the truth about who he is, where he's from, what she'll become. Every kiss would be tainted by his knowledge of the future. Every moment of connection would be shadowed by the ghost of Sirius Black's death, by the screams of the Longbottoms, by all the atrocities she hasn't committed yet but will. It would be a relationship born of obsession rather than love, two damaged souls finding each other at the worst possible moment. But then Voldemort would enter the picture more fully. In this timeline, the Dark Lord would be gathering his forces, recruiting followers, and Bellatrix Black would be exactly the type of witch he'd want. Powerful, pure-blooded, willing to embrace dark magic without hesitation. Harry would watch in horror as Voldemort begins to court Bellatrix, offering her power, purpose, a place in his new world order. And here's where Harry would face an impossible choice. Does he let history play out as it should, allowing Bellatrix to become the monster he knows? Or does he fight to keep her, even if it means changing everything about the future he came from? If Harry chose to fight for Bellatrix, to try to keep her from Voldemort's influence, he'd have to reveal more of himself than he ever intended. He'd have to tell her about the future, about what she becomes, about the war and the deaths and the destruction. Bellatrix's reaction to this knowledge would be critical. Would she be horrified by her future self, desperate to change her fate? Or would she be fascinated, drawn even more powerfully to the darkness she's destined for? Knowing Bellatrix's personality, the latter seems more likely. The knowledge that she becomes Voldemort's most feared lieutenant might appeal to her ambition, her desire for significance and power. This is where the scenario gets even darker. What if Bellatrix, upon learning about the future, decided she wanted that power, but with Harry at her side instead of Voldemort? What if she proposed they take a different path, building their own power base, creating their own vision for the wizarding world? Harry would be faced with the ultimate temptation. He has knowledge of the future, understanding of magic that won't be discovered for decades, and now a powerful ally willing to do whatever it takes to achieve their goals. Together, they could reshape the wizarding world according to their will. They could prevent the rise of Voldemort, yes, but at what cost? What kind of rulers would they become? This is the critical moment where Harry's character would truly be tested. Everything in his nature rebels against this path. He's not someone who seeks power, who wants to rule, who believes the ends justify the means. But he's also human, traumatized, exhausted from years of fighting, and for the first time someone is offering him a different choice. Not the burden of being the chosen one, not the weight of everyone's expectations, but the chance to be powerful enough that no one could ever hurt him or those he cares about again. And that someone is Bellatrix, intoxicating and dangerous and absolutely certain they could succeed. Let's say Harry, in a moment of weakness, of desperation, of twisted love, agrees. Let's follow this dark timeline and see where it leads. Harry and Bellatrix would begin working together, using Harry's knowledge of the future to prevent certain events while manipulating others to their advantage. They'd be playing a dangerous game, knowing that every change they make creates ripples that could alter everything. Harry's parents are still alive in this timeline, still students at Hogwarts, and Harry has to watch them from afar, unable to interact, unable to warn them about the future that may or may not still come to pass. Voldemort, sensing a disturbance in his plans, would become aware of Harry and Bellatrix as threats. Here's where we'd see a very different kind of wizarding war. Instead of Voldemort rising unopposed until Harry comes of age, we'd have a three-way conflict. Voldemort building his Death Eaters on one side, the Ministry trying to maintain order and deny anything is wrong, and in the shadows, Harry and Bellatrix building their own faction. They'd be recruiting witches and wizards disillusioned with both the status quo and Voldemort's pure blood mania. Their message would be more subtle, more seductive. Power through knowledge, strength through unity. A new order that protects the wizarding world from both Muggle persecution and internal corruption. The recruiting process would show us just how far Harry has fallen. He'd be using his fame as the boy who lived from his own timeline, which doesn't exist here, but he could fabricate proof of. to gain followers. He'd be promising protection and power, using Bellatrix's family connections and his own charisma to gather supporters. And Bellatrix would be in her element. She'd have Harry's knowledge, his power, and his complete devotion, and she'd use all of it to build their army. She'd be recruiting former classmates, young witches and wizards looking for purpose, anyone with power and ambition, and a willingness to get their hands dirty. Their faction would do things that would make Harry sick if he stopped to think about them clearly. They'd eliminate threats, manipulate ministry officials, steal magical artifacts that Harry knows will be important in the future. Bellatrix would handle the darker work, the torture when necessary, the killing when diplomacy failed, and Harry would tell himself he's doing this to prevent something worse, to stop Voldemort before he becomes unstoppable. But deep down, he'd know the truth. He's not preventing a Dark Lord from rising. He's becoming one himself. The relationship between Harry and Bellatrix during this period would be increasingly toxic and codependent. Bellatrix would love Harry's power, but resent his hesitation, his moments of conscience that she sees as weakness. Harry would be addicted to Bellatrix's certainty, her absolute conviction that they're doing the right thing. But he'd be haunted by nightmares of his friends. His real timeline, the hero he was supposed to be. They'd fight viciously, magically and verbally, destroying rooms in their rage at each other, only to come back together in passionate reconciliation, bound by their shared darkness and the knowledge that they've gone too far to turn back now. Their first major operation together would be infiltrating the Ministry of Magic. Harry would use his knowledge of future security measures, and Bellatrix would use her family's political connections to position their supporters in key departments. They'd start small, placing allies in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the Department of Mysteries, even getting someone into the minister's office as an aide. Each placement would be carefully calculated, each person chosen for their loyalty and their willingness to bend rules when necessary. Harry would justify it as building a network to combat Voldemort, but really, they were building their own shadow government. The process of corruption would be gradual and insidious. Harry would find himself making compromises he never thought he'd make. A witness who saw too much would need their memory modified. An Auror getting too close to their operations would need to be reassigned, or if they couldn't be bought or threatened, removed more permanently. Bellatrix would handle these darker tasks with enthusiasm, and Harry would let her, telling himself he was keeping his own hands clean, even as he gave the orders that stained them with blood. Their safe house would be located in a remote area, hidden under every protective enchantment Harry could remember, and some that Bellatrix invented. It would become a headquarters of sorts, where their inner circle would meet to plan operations. The inner circle would consist of carefully chosen witches and wizards, each bringing different skills to the table. There would be Abraxas Malfoy's younger brother, drawn to their cause by promises of power, without Voldemort's insanity. There would be a brilliant curse breaker who'd been expelled from Gringotts for ethical violations. There would be a former Auror who'd seen too much corruption in the ministry and wanted to burn it all down. And there would be others, each with their own reasons for following Harry and Bellatrix down this dark path. In their private moments, away from their followers, Harry and Bellatrix would have conversations that revealed the depth of their twisted bond. Bellatrix would curl up against Harry, tracing the lightning bolt scar on his forehead that existed in this timeline only because of the magical accident that brought him here. And she'd ask him about the future. She'd want to know everything about the woman she becomes, about her loyalty to Voldemort, about the kills she made and the fear she inspired. Harry would try to avoid these conversations, but Bellatrix was relentless. She'd seduce the information out of him, using her body and her words to make him talk about things he desperately wanted to forget. She'd be particularly fascinated by her future self's relationship with Voldemort. The devotion, the absolute loyalty, the willingness to die for the Dark Lord. She'd ask Harry if he thought she could feel that way about him instead, if the capacity for that kind of fanatical love could be redirected. Harry would want to say no, would want to believe that what they had was different, healthier. But he'd see the obsession growing in Bellatrix's eyes, and he'd know the truth. She was capable of that kind of devotion, and she was slowly transferring it from the Voldemort, who might have been, to the Harry who was right in front of her. The prophecy situation would become increasingly complex as events unfolded. In the original timeline, the prophecy spoke of the one with power to vanquish the Dark Lord, born as the 7th month dies. But in this altered timeline, with Harry from the future already present, and Voldemort aware of multiple threats, the prophecy would manifest differently when Sybil Trelawney spoke it. The words would be more ambiguous, speaking of 3 powers in the realm, of old magic and new, of a child who would either unite the fractured world or shatter it completely. Multiple people would hear this prophecy, and each would interpret it according to their own fears and ambitions. Voldemort would believe the prophecy referred to a child who could be his downfall, just as in the original timeline. He'd begin targeting pregnant women and families who fit the criteria, spreading terror as he tried to prevent the prophecy from coming true. The Ministry would interpret the prophecy as a warning about the growing instability, about the 3 factions, Harry and Bellatrix's group, Voldemort's Death Eaters, and the established order, tearing the wizarding world apart. And Harry, hearing about the prophecy through their intelligence network, would have a growing, terrible suspicion that it might be about him, about the choice he'd already made to build power with Bellatrix, about the child they might create together. Bellatrix's obsession with having a child with Harry would intensify after she learned about the prophecy. She'd see it as destiny, as proof that they were meant to create something powerful together, an heir who would inherit Harry's knowledge and her ruthlessness. She'd talk about it constantly, planning their future dynasty, imagining a son or daughter who would be the most powerful witch or wizard ever born. Harry would be increasingly disturbed by these conversations. The thought of bringing a child into the world they were creating, raising a child to be a weapon or a ruler, would horrify him. It would be one of the major points of contention between them, Bellatrix seeing it as their ultimate purpose and Harry seeing it as the line he couldn't cross. Meanwhile, James Potter and Lily Evans would be navigating their own complicated relationship at Hogwarts, completely unaware that their future son was in the same time period, fighting a shadow war. Harry would watch them from a distance whenever he could, using invisibility charms and careful timing to observe his parents as teenagers. He'd see James's arrogance and bravery, see Lily's kindness and fierce intelligence, and he'd be torn apart by the knowledge that in the original timeline, they die for him. He'd want desperately to warn them, to change their fate, but he'd also know that doing so could unravel everything. One night, unable to resist, Harry would follow his parents on one of their dates to Hogsmeade. He'd watch them at the 3 Broomsticks, laughing over butterbeers, so young and alive and in love. James would be showing off a little, making his wand perform tricks to make Lily laugh. Lily would be pretending to be exasperated but clearly charmed. And Harry would sit in the corner, hidden under every concealment charm he knew, watching his parents fall in love and feeling like his heart was being ripped out of his chest. This was what he was fighting for, he'd tell himself. He was building power so that people like his parents could be safe, so that Voldemort couldn't destroy innocent families. But the rationalization would ring hollow even in his own mind. Bellatrix would catch him after one of these surveillance sessions, would see the tears on his face and the pain in his eyes, and she'd know without him saying anything that he'd been watching the Potters again. She'd be jealous, irrationally and viciously jealous, seeing Harry's emotional connection to these people as a threat to their relationship. She'd demand to know what was so special about James and Lily Potter, why Harry cared so much about 2 random Gryffindors. Harry couldn't tell her the truth, so he'd lie, say they reminded him of people from his past, people he'd lost. Bellatrix wouldn't believe him, but she'd let it go, filing away the information about Harry's interest in the Potters for future reference. The tension between Harry and Bellatrix would escalate as their operation grew larger and more complex. They'd be commanding dozens of followers now, conducting operations across magical Britain, and the pressure would be enormous. Harry would be making decisions that affected people's lives, ordering actions that resulted in deaths, and the weight of it would be crushing him. He'd start having nightmares, vivid and terrible, where he'd see the faces of everyone he'd hurt. He'd dream about Hermione and Ron, wondering if they existed in this timeline, if they were just children somewhere, innocent and unaware of the monster their friend was becoming. Bellatrix would have no such qualms. She'd be thriving in their new role, reveling in the power and fear they commanded. She'd handle interrogations personally, using methods that made Harry sick when he thought about them too hard. She'd eliminate traitors and threats with cold efficiency, and she'd expect Harry to approve of her actions, to praise her loyalty and her strength. When Harry would express discomfort or hesitation, Bellatrix would accuse him of weakness, of not having the stomach for what needed to be done. Their fights would become more frequent and more vicious. With magic flying and furniture shattering, both of them pushed to the edge by the stress of their double lives. One of their major operations would involve stealing a time turner from the Department of Mysteries. Harry would convince himself that he needed it to get back to his own timeline, that this was always his endgame, to fix what had gone wrong and return home. But Bellatrix would have different ideas. She'd want to use the time turner to go further back, to prevent Voldemort from ever rising to power, or alternatively, to go forward and see the results of their work, to ensure their victory was complete. The argument over the time turner would be one of their most serious conflicts, revealing the fundamental differences in their goals and values that had been papered over by passion and obsession. The heist itself would be incredibly dangerous. They'd have to infiltrate the Department of Mysteries, bypass security measures that wouldn't be invented for years in the original timeline, but existed here because of the heightened tensions, and steal the time turner without being caught or killed. Harry would lead a team including Bellatrix and 3 of their most trusted followers. The operation would go sideways when they encountered unexpected resistance, unspeakables who'd been stationed there specifically because of intelligence about a possible theft. A fierce battle would erupt in the time room, surrounded by shelves of time turners and prophecy orbs. During the battle, one of Harry's followers would be killed, hit by a curse that aged him to death in seconds. Another would be captured, dragged away by Aurors who'd been called as backup. Harry and Bellatrix would barely escape with the time turner, using a portkey to return to their safe house. The operation would be a success in that they got what they came for, but it would also be a disaster. Their first major exposure. Their first undeniable proof to the Ministry that there was indeed a third faction operating in the shadows. The captured follower would be interrogated, and while he wouldn't break easily, eventually the Ministry would learn enough to start putting pieces together. In the aftermath of the failed operation, Harry would begin to seriously question what he'd become. He'd hold the time turner in his hands, this device that could potentially send him home, and he'd realize that he wasn't sure he deserved to go home anymore. How could he face Ron and Hermione after everything he'd done? How could he look Dumbledore in the eye? How could he pretend to be the hero they all thought he was, when he'd spent months or years becoming exactly what they fought against? The time turner represented not freedom but judgment, and Harry wasn't sure he was ready to face that judgment. Bellatrix would sense Harry's wavering commitment, and she'd double down on securing his loyalty. She'd become more possessive, more demanding of his time and attention. She'd orchestrate situations where Harry would have to prove his dedication to their cause, to her. She'd create tests, increasingly dark and twisted, pushing Harry to cross lines he'd been reluctant to cross. She'd bring him a captured Auror and demand that Harry interrogate him personally, use the Cruciatus curse, prove that he was truly committed to their vision. When Harry would hesitate, Bellatrix would taunt him, call him weak, accuse him of never really loving her, of always seeing her as the monster from his timeline, rather than the woman standing in front of him. The breaking point would come when Bellatrix decided to target Lily Evans directly. She'd finally figured out through careful observation and some legitimacy on Harry during a vulnerable moment that Lily was important to him, though she didn't understand why. In Bellatrix's twisted logic, eliminating Lily would sever Harry's connection to whatever was holding him back, would force him to commit fully to their cause with no ties to his old life or old values. She'd plan the attack carefully, choosing a moment when Lily would be alone, vulnerable, away from James and the other marauders who might protect her. Harry would discover Bellatrix's plan by accident, overhearing her discussing it with one of their inner circle members. The realization would hit him like a physical blow. Bellatrix was planning to kill his mother, not the woman who'd already died for him in another timeline, but the girl who would become his mother, who was currently just a 7th-year student with her whole life ahead of her. In that moment, everything would crystallize for Harry. Every rationalization, every justification, every lie he'd told himself about building power to protect people would shatter. Bellatrix wasn't his partner in creating a better world. She was a monster, and he'd been enabling her, empowering her, loving her, even as she planned to destroy everything he cared about. Harry's confrontation with Bellatrix would be explosive. He'd storm into their chambers, magic crackling around him, and demand that she call off the attack on Lily. Bellatrix would be genuinely confused at first, not understanding why this one girl mattered so much. When Harry refused to explain, refused to back down, Bellatrix's confusion would turn to rage. She'd accuse him of having feelings for Lily, of wanting her instead of Bellatrix. Harry would deny it, but his desperation to protect Lily would only confirm Bellatrix's suspicions in her increasingly unhinged mind. The argument would escalate into a duel, both of them unleashing magic with lethal intent, destroying their quarters and sending their followers scrambling for cover. The duel would be brutal and bitter, each of them using magic the other had taught them, strategies they'd developed together, now turned against each other. Bellatrix would fight with the fury of a woman betrayed, screaming curses and accusations between spells. Harry would fight with the desperation of someone who'd finally woken up to the nightmare he'd created, and was trying frantically to fix it before it was too late. They'd match each other spell for spell, both of them powerful, both of them trained, both of them willing to kill the person they'd claimed to love just moments before. Harry would eventually gain the upper hand, not through superior skill, but through his willingness to use tactics Bellatrix wouldn't expect from him. He'd feint toward dark magic she'd taught him, then switch to defensive spells and clever transfiguration, using the full breadth of magical knowledge rather than just the destructive curses Bellatrix favored. He'd manage to disarm her, to bind her with conjured ropes that tightened with every struggle, and he'd stand over her with his wand pointed at her heart, facing the choice of whether to kill her or let her live. Looking down at Bellatrix, bound and helpless but still defiant, still beautiful in her rage, Harry would see both the woman he'd fallen for and the monster she'd always been destined to become. He'd see his own reflection in her eyes, see the darkness he'd embraced, the lines he'd crossed, the person he'd become in her company, and he'd realize that killing her would be mercy, would be preventing all the atrocities she'd commit in the future. But it would also be murder, cold-blooded and inexcusable. Harry had killed in battle, in self-defense, but never like this, never execution of a helpless prisoner. To kill Bellatrix now would be to complete his transformation into the Dark Lord he'd been becoming. Instead, Harry would make a different choice. He'd use a complex memory charm, one he'd learned from studying the Department of Mysteries research, to remove Bellatrix's memories of him, of their time together, of everything they'd built. He'd essentially reset her to the person she was before they met, giving her a chance to make different choices, even knowing she probably wouldn't. It would be an act of mercy that Bellatrix would never have shown him. And in performing it, Harry would be reclaiming a piece of his humanity, proving to himself that he wasn't completely lost. Before erasing himself from Bellatrix's memory, Harry would speak to her one last time. He'd tell her that in another timeline, another life, she becomes exactly what her worst impulses want her to be. She becomes powerful and feared and completely devoted to a Dark Lord, and it destroys her. It turns her into something barely human, something that laughs as it kills, something that ends up dying on a battlefield with no one to mourn her. He'd tell her that she has a choice right now to be something different, something better. And then, not waiting for her response, not wanting to hear her scorn or her promises to hunt him down, he'd cast the charm and watch as recognition faded from her eyes. Replaced by confusion, and then blankness, Harry would leave Bellatrix unconscious in the ruins of their headquarters, protected by charms that would keep her safe until she woke with no memory of the last months or years. Then he'd gather the time turner and what few possessions mattered to him, and he'd begin the process of dismantling everything they'd built. He'd send messages to their followers, dissolving the organization, returning the loyalty they'd pledged to him. Some would be relieved, ready to return to normal life. Others would be angry, feeling betrayed, and Harry would have to deal with them more permanently, obliviating those who knew too much and binding the rest with magical oaths to never speak of their activities. The process of undoing the damage he'd done would take weeks. Harry would work with Dumbledore, finally revealing himself and his true origin, begging for help to repair the timeline as much as possible. Dumbledore, shocked but not entirely surprised he'd suspected something strange was occurring, would agree to help, though he'd make it clear that some damage couldn't be undone. People had died because of Harry and Bellatrix's actions. Families had been destroyed. The ripples they'd created in the timeline couldn't simply be smoothed away. Harry would have to live with that, with the knowledge that in trying to prevent one tragedy, he'd created countless others. Dumbledore would reveal that he'd been aware of Harry's presence in the timeline for months, had been watching from afar, trying to determine if Harry was a threat or a potential ally. He'd seen Harry's initial resistance to dark magic, his struggle with Bellatrix's influence, and he'd hoped that Harry would find his way back to the light before it was too late. Now, with Harry finally seeking redemption, Dumbledore would offer what help he could. Together, they'd work on a ritual to send Harry back to his own timeline. Using the stolen time turner, Dumbledore's extensive knowledge of temporal magic, and a significant sacrifice of power from both of them. The night before the ritual, Harry would do something incredibly risky. He'd go to Godric's Hollow, where the Potters were now living after graduation, James working for the Order, and Lily pregnant with the child who would become Harry in the original timeline. If that timeline still existed after all the changes Harry had made. Harry wouldn't approach the house, wouldn't risk being seen, but he'd cast every protective enchantment he could think of around their property, layering wards upon wards, some of which wouldn't be invented for years. He'd pour all his remaining power, all his love for the parents he'd lost and might have saved, into protecting them. It wouldn't be enough to stop Voldemort if the Dark Lord truly targeted them, but it might buy them time, might make the difference between life and death. As Harry worked on the protections, James would sense the magic and come outside to investigate. Harry would freeze, hidden under his invisibility cloak, watching as his father scanned the area with his wand out, looking for threats. James wouldn't be able to see Harry, but he'd sense that someone had been there, that powerful magic had been cast around his home. For a moment, father and son would be separated by mere feet and 20 years, and Harry would want desperately to speak, to warn, to embrace the father he'd barely known. But he'd remain silent, and after a few minutes, James would return inside, shaking his head and telling Lily it was probably just a stray ward from the Order's security measures. The ritual to send Harry home would be performed in the Room of Requirement at Hogwarts, with Dumbledore leading and Harry providing the temporal anchor, his memory of his own time serving as a beacon for the magic to follow. The process would be excruciating, like being torn apart and reassembled across dimensions. Harry would experience flashes of different timelines, different versions of events playing out in parallel. He'd see the timeline where he stayed with Bellatrix, and they became the darkest rulers in wizarding history. He'd see the timeline where Bellatrix killed him when he tried to leave. He'd see the timeline where he successfully reformed her, and they built something genuinely good together. He'd see dozens, hundreds of variations, each one a road not taken, a choice not made. Through all of it, Harry would hold on to his memory of home, of Ron and Hermione, of Dumbledore's office and the Gryffindor common room, of Sirius and all the people he'd lost and fought to protect. He'd focus on that, use it as an anchor, and slowly, agonizingly, he'd feel himself being pulled back to his own time, his own reality. The last thing he'd see of the alternate timeline would be Dumbledore's face, aged and weary, with eyes that held both disappointment and hope. Dumbledore would mouth words that Harry couldn't hear over the roar of temporal magic, but he'd understand them anyway. Do better, be better. Remember what you learned here, and choose differently when the darkness calls again. when Harry finally materialized in his own timeline. He'd be in the Department of Mysteries, exactly where he'd been when the time accident occurred. But only seconds would have passed here, though he'd experienced months or years in the other timeline. The battle with the Death Eaters would still be raging around him. His friends would be fighting for their lives, and there across the room would be Bellatrix Lestrange, older, marked by Azkaban, cackling as she dueled Kingsley Shacklebolt. This was the Bellatrix of his timeline, the one who'd never known him, never loved him, never built a dark empire at his side. Harry would stagger from the disorientation of the temporal shift, and Hermione would grab his arm, asking if he was all right, if he was hurt. He'd look at her, his best friend, brilliant and brave and everything good in the world, and he'd want to break down, to confess everything he'd done in that other timeline. But there was no time. The battle was still happening. His friends were still in danger. And Bellatrix was there, raising her wand toward Sirius, the curse already forming on her lips. Harry would react without thinking, sending a stunner toward Bellatrix, but it would be too late. The jet of red light would hit her a fraction of a second after she'd cast her own curse, and Sirius would fall backward through the veil, leaving Harry alone with the knowledge of his godfather's death and the memory of loving the woman who'd killed him. Harry's grief and rage in that moment would be layered in ways no one around him could understand. He'd be mourning Sirius, yes, but he'd also be mourning the Bellatrix from the other timeline, the woman she could have been if circumstances had been different. He'd be mourning the version of himself that fell in love with her, that believed he could save her, that became a monster trying. When he chased Bellatrix through the department, when he tried to use the Cruciatus curse on her, there would be a power behind it that surprised even him, a darkness born not just of grief but of intimate knowledge of what she was capable of, what they'd been capable of together. Voldemort would arrive and save Bellatrix, and Harry would stand alone in the atrium of the Ministry, facing the Dark Lord while his friends were evacuated. Dumbledore would arrive to duel Voldemort, and in that moment, Harry would feel a flash of the timeline he'd left behind. The alternate Dumbledore who'd helped him return home, who'd seen Harry at his worst and still believed he could be better. This Dumbledore knew nothing of Harry's temporal adventure, but Harry would see him with new eyes, understanding the weight of the choices Dumbledore had made, the sacrifices he'd accepted, the darkness he'd resisted throughout his long life. In the aftermath of the Department of Mysteries, Harry would struggle profoundly with integrating the memories of two timelines, two sets of experiences, two very different versions of himself. He'd have spent months or years in the alternate timeline, lived through experiences that shaped and changed him, only to return to a present where almost no time had passed. His friends would notice something different about him, a haunted quality that went beyond normal grief over Sirius's death. He'd flinch when Bellatrix was mentioned, carry guilt that made no sense given the events they all experienced. Hermione, perceptive as always, would confront Harry a few weeks after they returned to Hogwarts. She'd corner him in the library, wait until everyone else had left, and ask him directly what happened in the Department of Mysteries, what really happened beyond the official story. Harry would want to tell her everything, to share the burden of what he'd experienced, but how could he? How could he explain that he'd lived another life in another timeline, that he'd fallen in love with Bellatrix Lestrange and become a Dark Lord, that he'd done things as terrible as anything Voldemort had done? Hermione would see the truth in his eyes, maybe not the specifics, but the weight of it, and she'd tell him that whatever he'd experienced, whatever choices he'd made, he was home now, and they'd face it together. Harry's 6th year would be profoundly affected by his alternate timeline experiences. When he and Dumbledore began their private lessons about Voldemort's past and the Horcruxes, Harry would engage with the material on a completely different level. He'd understand viscerally, not intellectually, how a person could spiral into darkness, how good intentions could pave the road to hell, how love could become possessive and destructive. When Dumbledore spoke about Voldemort's inability to understand love, Harry would think about his twisted relationship with Bellatrix. Wonder if what they'd shared was love, or just obsession and mutual corruption. The lessons about Horcruxes would hit Harry particularly hard because he'd have intimate knowledge, of how far someone could go in pursuit of power and immortality. He'd see the parallels between Voldemort's choices and his own in that alternate timeline, how they'd both rationalized terrible actions as necessary steps toward a greater good. Harry would understand why Dumbledore was so careful in revealing this information, why he emphasized the moral implications of dark magic rather than just the mechanics. Every lesson would be a mirror held up to Harry's own capacity for darkness, a reminder of who he'd been in that other life. Harry's relationship with romance would be complicated by his alternate timeline experiences. Ginny Weasley, who had feelings for Harry and would eventually pursue him, would sense his reluctance to get close to her. She'd see how he'd pull away when things got too intense, how he'd sabotage their moments of connection. Harry would be terrified of his own capacity for obsession, afraid that if he let himself love someone, he'd become the person he was with Bellatrix, possessive and destructive, and willing to cross any line. Ginny would be patient at first, then frustrated, not understanding what invisible barrier stood between them. The relationship would eventually develop, but it would be Harry's constant vigilance against his own darkness that would make it work. He'd set boundaries for himself, rules about how to love someone without consuming them. He'd be hyper-aware of any possessive thoughts, any impulse to control or manipulate. He'd probably be too cautious, too restrained, and Ginny would have to slowly coax him into trusting himself and their relationship. She'd never fully understand why Harry was so careful, so afraid of his own feelings, but she'd love him through it. Prove through patience and persistence that not all passion led to destruction. The Horcrux hunt in 7th year would take on new dimensions for Harry because of his alternate timeline knowledge. When they encountered Death Eaters, when they heard reports of Voldemort's movements, Harry would sometimes have flashes of how things played out differently in that other timeline. He'd know strategies that wouldn't be developed for years, understand magical theory that hadn't been discovered yet, and he'd have to be careful about how he used this knowledge without revealing its source. Ron and Hermione would notice Harry's sometimes uncanny ability to predict Death Eater tactics, his understanding of dark magic that seemed too deep, but they'd attribute it to his connection with Voldemort rather than the truth. The capture at Malfoy Manor and Bellatrix's torture of Hermione would be the most psychologically damaging experience for Harry since his return from the alternate timeline. He'd be forced to listen to his best friend's screams while being restrained, unable to help, and the voice causing that pain would belong to a woman he'd once claimed to love in another life. Harry would be torn apart by conflicting emotions, hatred for Bellatrix the Death Eater, and guilt over having loved any version of her, rage at his helplessness and self-loathing for the part of him that still remembered her differently. When they finally escaped, when Hermione was being tended to by Fleur and Madame Pomfrey, Harry would break down completely, sobbing in a way he hadn't since Sirius died, mourning not just what had happened but the weight of everything he carried from that alternate timeline. Hermione, recovering from her ordeal, would find Harry later that night. She'd sit beside him, scarred and hurting but alive, and she'd tell him that she knew something was wrong, something beyond the normal trauma of war. She'd tell him that whatever had happened to him, whatever darkness he'd experienced or become, he was still Harry Potter, still her best friend, still the person who'd saved her life countless times. She'd tell him that redemption wasn't about being perfect. It was about choosing to do better every day, even when it was hard. And Harry finally would tell her everything. He'd tell her about the alternate timeline, about falling in love with Bellatrix, about becoming a Dark Lord, about all the terrible choices he'd made. Hermione would listen without judgment, and when he was done, she'd simply hug him and tell him he'd come back, that he'd chosen to be better, and that was what mattered. Ron would eventually learn the truth too, though Harry would struggle to tell him. Ron's reaction would be different from Hermione's, more visceral, more openly disturbed by the idea of Harry with Bellatrix Lestrange. But after the initial shock, Ron would process it in his own way, and eventually he'd tell Harry that everyone had the capacity for darkness, that the war had pushed all of them to the edge of what they could bear, and that what mattered was the choices they made when they came back from that edge. Ron's acceptance, simple and straightforward and utterly loyal, would help Harry forgive himself more than anything else could. The final battle at Hogwarts would be informed by Harry's alternate timeline experiences in ways both obvious and subtle. He'd fight with the skill and knowledge of someone who'd commanded armies, who'd planned military campaigns, who understood tactics and strategy at a level far beyond his years. The Order members and defenders of Hogwarts would notice Harry's transformation into a battlefield commander, would follow his orders because he gave them with absolute authority and confidence. But Harry would also fight with the restraint of someone who knew how easy it was to go too far, who understood that winning without becoming the monster you fought was just as important as winning itself. When Harry learned that he was a Horcrux, that he'd have to die to defeat Voldemort, his reaction would be complex. Part of him would see it as justice, as atonement for what he'd done in that alternate timeline. If he died here, died as a hero sacrificing himself for the greater good, it would balance the scales, would prove that his darkness in that other life didn't define him. But another part of Harry, the part that had fought so hard to return from that timeline, to choose redemption over destruction, would rage against the injustice of it. He'd survived becoming a Dark Lord, fought his way back to the light, only to learn that survival was never really an option. The walk into the Forbidden Forest, surrounded by the ghosts of his loved ones summoned by the Resurrection Stone, would be Harry's final reckoning with the alternate timeline. The stone would show him not just Sirius, Lupin, and his parents from this timeline, but also, flickering and uncertain, images from the other timeline. He'd see the alternate versions of his parents, the James and Lily he'd protected with wards, who might be alive in that other reality. He'd see the alternate Dumbledore who'd helped him come home, and he'd see, just for a moment, Bellatrix as she was before she became a monster, before either timeline corrupted her, just a young witch with power and potential and choices yet to make. His parents, both versions somehow merged in the stone's magic, would tell him they were proud of him, not just for being brave enough to die, but for being strong enough to come back from the darkness, to choose light even after experiencing the seductive pull of power. Sirius would tell him that loving someone didn't excuse their actions or make you responsible for their choices, that Bellatrix's darkness was her own, in every timeline. Lupin would remind him that being a monster once didn't make you a monster forever, that every moment offered a chance to choose differently. And then Harry would let the stone fall from his nerveless fingers, and he'd walk forward to meet Voldemort and the death he both deserved and didn't. Voldemort's killing curse would strike Harry, and in the moment of death, Harry would experience something extraordinary. He'd see all the timelines, all the possible versions of himself, the infinite variations of choices and consequences. He'd see timelines where he never traveled to the past, where he grew up normal, where his parents lived, where he died as a baby, where he became the next Dark Lord, where he and Bellatrix ruled together. He'd see that in most timelines he made the heroic choice, stood against darkness, sacrificed himself when necessary. The timeline where he fell, where he loved Bellatrix and became a Dark Lord, was an aberration, a warning, a road less traveled for good reason. And then he'd be in King's Cross, or the representation of it, with Dumbledore waiting to explain about choices and consequences, and the power of love. When Harry returned to life, when he awakened in Hagrid's arms with Voldemort declaring his victory, Harry would know with absolute certainty that he'd chosen correctly. He'd survived death twice now, once in his original timeline, and once when he returned from the alternate timeline, and both times he'd been given another chance, another opportunity to be better. He'd stand, face Voldemort in the Great Hall, and when he finally cast the spell that ended the Dark Lord's life, he'd be ending not just Voldemort but the shadow of the Dark Lord he himself had been in that other life. The spell would be Expelliarmus, not a killing curse, because even after everything, even knowing what he was capable of, Harry would choose to win without killing, to prove that strength didn't require cruelty. In the aftermath of Voldemort's death, there would be one final encounter with Bellatrix, or rather, with her absence. Harry would learn that Bellatrix had died in the battle, killed by Molly Weasley while trying to murder Ginny. He'd go to where her body lay among the other dead Death Eaters, covered by a simple sheet because no one wanted to look at her face. Harry would pull back the sheet, look at her one last time, and see not the woman he'd loved in another timeline, but the monster she'd become in this one. The two Bellatrixes, the one he'd known in the past and the one who'd terrorized the present, would finally merge in his mind, and he'd understand that they were both real, both possible, both her. She'd been capable of loving him, but she'd also been capable of this, of torture and murder and fanatical devotion to evil. Both versions were true, and that was the tragedy of it. Harry would cast a quiet blessing over Bellatrix's body, something simple and ancient that he'd learned in the alternate timeline. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't absolution, just an acknowledgement that she'd been human once, that she'd had choices and made terrible ones, that in another life things might have been different. Then he'd replace the sheet and walk away, leaving Bellatrix Lestrange behind in every timeline, every version, every possible world. He'd walk back to his friends, to Ginny waiting for him, to Ron and Hermione and the family he'd chosen, and he'd let the alternate timeline finally, truly, be just a memory. The years following the war would be Harry's true test of whether he'd learned anything from his alternate timeline experiences. He'd be offered positions of power, first as an Auror and then, inevitably, in higher levels of magical government. People would want to make him Minister of Magic, would see him as the natural leader to rebuild the wizarding world. And Harry, remembering how intoxicating power had been with Bellatrix, how easy it had been to rationalize darker and darker actions in pursuit of good goals, would turn down most of these offers. He'd accept the Auror position because it let him help people without commanding them, because it kept him close to the work without putting him in charge of policy and power. His relationship with Ginny would deepen over the years, built on honesty and trust and the hard work of being vulnerable with another person. Harry would tell her eventually about the alternate timeline, about Bellatrix and the darkness he'd embraced. Ginny's reaction would surprise him. She'd be hurt that he'd kept it from her for so long, yes, but she'd also understand why. She'd tell him that everyone had the capacity for darkness, that the war had shown her own capacity for violence and hatred, and that what mattered was that he'd chosen to come back. She'd tell him she loved him not despite his darkness, but including it, that she loved the whole complicated person he was, scars and all. Harry and Ginny's wedding would be a small affair, just close friends and family, but it would mean everything to Harry. Walking down the aisle, promising his life to someone, would be a declaration that he believed in his own capacity for healthy love, that he trusted himself not to become the person he'd been with Bellatrix. When he'd slipped the ring onto Ginny's finger, he'd be thinking about the alternate timeline, about the dark dynasty Bellatrix had wanted to create with him. And he'd be consciously choosing this instead, choosing partnership over possession, choosing light over darkness, choosing Ginny over the ghost of a woman who'd never really existed in this timeline. The birth of Harry's children would force him to confront the alternate timeline in new ways. When James Sirius was born, when Harry held his son for the first time, he'd remember Bellatrix's obsession with having a child with him, her conviction that they could create the most powerful witch or wizard ever born. He'd look at James Sirius, tiny and helpless and utterly dependent, and he'd be grateful beyond words that this child was born into a world of love and peace, rather than into the dark empire he and Bellatrix had been building. He'd promise himself that his children would never be weapons or tools or anything other than people, free to make their own choices and their own mistakes. As Harry's children grew, he'd watch them carefully for signs of darkness, for indications that they'd inherited his capacity for moral compromise. He'd be overprotective at times, seeing threats where there were none, and Ginny would have to remind him to let the children be children, to trust that they were raising them with good values and strong moral foundations. When Albus Severus worried about being sorted into Slytherin, when he asked if he'd be evil if the hat chose that house, Harry's answer would be informed by everything he'd experienced. He'd tell Albus that houses didn't determine character, that Slytherin had produced both heroes and villains, and that what mattered was the choices you made when you were tested. He'd tell him, though not in so many words, that even heroes could fall, and even those who'd fallen could find their way back. Harry's work as an Auror would continue for years, and he'd become known for his unusual approach to dealing with dark wizards. He'd be more willing than most to offer chances for redemption, to look for the circumstances that led someone to make dark choices. But he'd also be absolutely ruthless with those who'd had chances and chosen to continue down the dark path, because he understood that sometimes people were simply committed to evil, that not everyone could be saved or wanted to be saved. His colleagues would sometimes find his combination of compassion and ruthlessness confusing, but it would make him remarkably effective at his job. In his 40s, Harry would be approached by a researcher from the Department of Mysteries who'd been investigating temporal anomalies. The researcher would have detected evidence of a significant temporal disturbance in the 1970s, a foreign presence that appeared briefly and caused cascading changes before disappearing. The researcher would ask Harry if he knew anything about it, would show him evidence of magical signatures that matched Harry's own magical signature, though the data suggested the presence predated Harry's birth by decades. Harry would look at the evidence, recognize the traces of his own time in the alternate timeline, and he'd lie. He'd tell the researcher he had no idea what could have caused such an anomaly, suggest it might be natural temporal fluctuations or experimental magic from that era. The researcher would be unsatisfied, but would have no choice but to accept Harry's denial. After the researcher left, Harry would sit alone in his office, holding the report with its graphs and charts documenting his presence in another time. The alternate timeline wasn't as erased as he'd thought. Traces remained, evidence of his time there, of the choices he'd made. Harry would consider destroying the report, using his authority to bury the research. But then he'd decide against it. Let the evidence exist. Let there be proof somewhere that even heroes could fall, that even the best of us were capable of terrible things under the right circumstances. Maybe someday, when enough time had passed, the truth would come out. And maybe that would be a good thing. Maybe future generations needed to know that Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the chosen one, the defeater of Voldemort, had once been a Dark Lord in another timeline, and had fought his way back to the light. Harry would occasionally have nightmares about the alternate timeline, vivid dreams where he was still there, still with Bellatrix, still building their dark empire. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, reaching for his wand, ready to fight, and Ginny would wake with him, hold him until the shaking stopped, remind him that it wasn't real, that he was home, that he'd chosen differently. But in a sense it was real. The alternate timeline existed somewhere in the multiverse, a branch of reality where Harry had made different choices. There was a version of him out there, or there had been, who'd stayed with Bellatrix, who'd become everything he fought against. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting, a reminder of the roads not taken, the disasters averted, the darkness resisted. In his 50s, Harry would write a memoir, but it would be incomplete, carefully edited to omit certain truths. He'd write about the war, about Voldemort, about the Horcruxes and the battle and the sacrifice. But he wouldn't write about the alternate timeline, about Bellatrix, about the months or years he'd spent becoming a Dark Lord. He'd justify the omission as protecting his family, not wanting his children to know that version of him. But really it was cowardice, an unwillingness to face public judgment for choices he'd made in a timeline that technically never happened. Hermione, reading the manuscript, would notice the gap, would recognize what was missing, and she'd tell Harry that he was being dishonest, that his story wasn't complete without the darkness. Harry would argue that some truths didn't need to be told, that the alternate timeline was his burden to bear alone. They'd fight about it, one of their rare, serious disagreements, and eventually Harry would agree to include a fictionalized version, a brief mention of a temporal accident that showed him what he could become if he made wrong choices. It would be the truth, just obscured, mythologized, safe. The memoir would be published and become enormously popular, a bestseller that every young witch and wizard read. Harry would do few interviews, uncomfortable with the attention. But in one particularly probing interview, a journalist would ask him about the temporal accident he'd mentioned, about what he'd seen that frightened him so much. Harry would look directly into the camera, and he'd say that he'd seen a version of himself who'd fallen in love with darkness, who'd rationalize terrible actions as necessary, who'd become the thing he fought against. He'd say that everyone had that capacity, that the difference between hero and villain was often just circumstances and choices, and that the most important thing anyone could do was remain vigilant against their own capacity for evil. The journalist would press for details, but Harry would refuse to say more, leaving the audience to speculate about what he'd really experienced. In his 60s, Harry would be diagnosed with a rare magical condition caused by repeated exposure to time-turner magic and temporal distortions. The healers would be puzzled by the severity of his condition, noting that he'd only used a time-turner once, briefly, during his 3rd year at Hogwarts. Harry wouldn't correct them, wouldn't explain that he'd actually spent months or years in an alternate timeline, that his body had aged differently than the world around him, that he was technically older than his chronological age suggested. The condition would be manageable with potions and regular healer visits, but it would be a reminder that actions had consequences, that even in another timeline, even choices that were technically unmade, left marks on the soul and body. Ginny would nurse Harry through the worst of his temporal condition, sitting with him on the bad days when the world seemed to flicker between timelines, when he'd see ghosts of people who didn't exist in this reality. She'd hold his hand and tell him stories about their children and grandchildren, anchor him to this timeline, to this reality, to the life they'd built together. Harry would be grateful for her strength, for her unwavering presence, and he'd think about how different this was from his relationship with Bellatrix, how love could be a foundation instead of a fire, how partnership could heal rather than destroy. He'd tell Ginny he loved her, words he said often but meant more deeply each time, and she'd smile and tell him she knew, that she'd always known, even when he'd been too afraid of himself to fully love her back. In his 70s, Harry would write another book. This one not a memoir but a guide for young aurors on recognizing and resisting dark magic. The book would be unusual in its approach, focusing not on the mechanics of dark spells, but on the psychological vulnerabilities that made people susceptible to darkness. Harry would write about how dark magic preys on pain and anger, how it offers power and control to those who feel powerless, how it promises simple solutions to complex problems. He'd write about how good people could do terrible things if they convinced themselves the ends justified the means. He'd write about how love could be twisted into possession, how protection could become control, how the desire to keep people safe could lead to taking away their freedom. Every page would be informed by his experiences in the alternate timeline, by his intimate knowledge of how darkness worked, by his understanding of his own capacity for evil. The book would be controversial, with some critics arguing that Harry was too sympathetic to dark wizards, that he seemed to understand them too well. Others would praise the book's nuance, its refusal to reduce complex moral questions to simple answers. The book would become required reading at Auror training programs, and would be taught in defense against the dark arts classes at Hogwarts. Harry would receive letters from witches and wizards who'd been on the edge of darkness, who'd been tempted by dark magic, who'd read his book and felt understood, felt less alone, felt like maybe they could resist after all. These letters would mean more to Harry than all the awards and honors he'd received over the years, because they suggested that his fall in the alternate timeline, as terrible as it had been, might ultimately serve some good purpose. As Harry approached 80, he'd begin to feel the pull of mortality more strongly. His temporal condition would worsen, requiring more intervention from healers, and he'd know that his time was running out. He'd gather his children and grandchildren, tell them stories about the war, about Voldemort, about the friends he'd lost and the battles he'd won. But he still wouldn't tell them about the alternate timeline, about Bellatrix, about the Dark Lord he'd been. That secret would remain between him, Hermione, Ron, and Ginny, the only ones who knew the full truth. Hermione would argue with him about this even now, tell him that his grandchildren deserved to know the whole story, but Harry would be adamant. Let them remember him as the hero, he'd say. Let them remember the choices he made right, not the ones he made wrong in a timeline that no longer existed. On his deathbed, surrounded by his family, Harry would drift in and out of consciousness, experiencing visions that blurred the line between timelines. He'd see Bellatrix as she was in the alternate timeline, young and powerful and beautiful, before darkness fully claimed her. He'd see the empire they'd built together, the followers they'd commanded, the destruction they'd caused. He'd see the moment he'd chosen to leave, to undo it all, to return to the light, and he'd see Bellatrix in this timeline, older and marked by Azkaban, laughing as she killed Sirius, dying on the floor of the Great Hall. Both versions would feel equally real, both timelines equally lived. Harry would whisper something that no one quite caught, something that might have been an apology or a goodbye, or simply a final acknowledgement of a love that should never have been. And then he'd close his eyes and let go, confident that whatever came next he'd earned it, both the punishment and the peace. At Harry's funeral, the entire wizarding world would mourn, thousands gathering to honor the man who'd saved them. Speaker after speaker would stand and talk about Harry's heroism, his sacrifice, his unwavering commitment to the light. Hermione, now ancient herself but still sharp, would give the final eulogy. She'd talk about Harry's courage, yes, but also about his capacity for redemption, his willingness to face his own darkness and choose differently. She'd speak in careful language, revealing nothing explicit but hinting at truths that most people wouldn't understand. She'd say that Harry had fought battles no one knew about, had resisted temptations that would have destroyed lesser people, had chosen light over darkness every day, sometimes multiple times a day for his entire life. And for those who understood, who knew the secret of the alternate timeline, her words would be a final testament to the truth that heroism wasn't about never falling, but about climbing back up every time you did. Years after Harry's death, researchers studying his personal effects would discover a pensive memory, carefully preserved and marked with instructions not to open it until 50 years after his death. When the designated time arrived, when everyone who'd known Harry personally was long dead, the memory would be viewed by the headmistress of Hogwarts and the head of the Department of Mysteries. They'd see everything, the full story of the alternate timeline, Harry's fall and rise, his relationship with Bellatrix, the darkness he'd embraced and ultimately rejected. They'd see a side of Harry Potter that contradicted every story they'd been told, every legend they'd heard, and they'd have to decide what to do with this knowledge, whether to reveal it to the world or keep it hidden, whether Harry's legacy should include his darkest chapter, or whether that mercy should be granted even posthumously. The headmistress would argue for revelation, saying that future generations needed to know that even their greatest heroes were fallible, that anyone could fall, that vigilance against darkness was a constant requirement. The head of the Department of Mysteries would argue for secrecy, saying that some truths did more harm than good, that the myth of Harry Potter served a valuable purpose, that destroying that myth would destabilize the wizarding world's moral foundations. They'd debate for hours, each making valid points, neither able to fully convince the other. Finally, they'd compromise. They'd create a restricted archive, accessible only to those in positions of significant moral authority, where the full truth would be preserved, and they'd release a sanitized version to the public, acknowledging that Harry had faced dark temptations and struggled with moral choices, but omitting the specific details of his relationship with Bellatrix and his time as a Dark Lord in an alternate timeline. The debate over Harry's legacy would continue for generations, with some seeing him as a flawless hero and others as a more complex, conflicted figure. The truth would be somewhere in between, as truth usually was. Harry Potter had been a hero, yes, but he'd also been human, capable of falling, capable of darkness, capable of loving the wrong person and making terrible choices. What made him exceptional wasn't that he'd never fallen, but that he'd climbed back up, that he'd recognized his mistakes and corrected them, that he'd spent the rest of his life proving that his one great fall didn't define him. In the end, maybe that was the most important lesson, the truest legacy. Not that heroes were perfect, but that they kept trying to be better, kept choosing light over darkness, kept fighting their own worst impulses until the very end. And somewhere in the multiverse, in the alternate timeline Harry had left behind, another version of events would have played out. Perhaps the alternate timeline Harry, the one who'd stayed with Bellatrix, had eventually been overthrown by his own followers, or killed by Voldemort, or consumed by the darkness he'd embraced. Perhaps he'd ruled for decades, becoming the thing he'd feared, a Dark Lord more terrible than Voldemort because he'd started with noble intentions and lost his way. Or perhaps in that timeline, something unexpected had happened. Perhaps the alternate Harry, without the real Harry there to pull him back, had eventually found his own redemption, had turned against Bellatrix and dismantled their empire himself, had found his way back to the light through his own journey. There was no way to know. The timelines were separate, unreachable, each playing out according to its own logic and choices. But in this timeline, the one Harry had returned to and lived out his life in, the story ended not with his fall but with his rise, not with darkness but with light, not with Bellatrix Lestrange, but with Ginny Weasley and the family they'd built and the life they'd lived. And that had to be enough. That had to matter. In a multiverse of infinite possibilities, Harry had chosen this one, had fought to return to it, had spent his entire life proving that this choice, this timeline, this version of himself was who he wanted to be. And in the end, when all the stories were told and all the memories were viewed and all the truths were revealed, that would be the most important thing. Not that Harry Potter had never fallen, but that he'd chosen to stand back up. Not that he'd never loved darkness, but that he'd loved light more. Not that he'd been perfect, but that he'd been human and tried and mostly succeeded. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the story that mattered, the truth that endured, the legacy that would inspire generations to come. The story of a boy who became a Dark Lord in another timeline, and a hero in this one, and proved that the difference between the two was nothing more and nothing less than choice.